Welcome to this discussion regarding Chapter 3 of the Social Psychology textbook. So today we're going to be focusing on the self. On this slide, we have the questions that we might ask when we're learning about social psychology in this chapter. So first and foremost, what is self-awareness? How does it develop? And how is it unique to humans? When presenting themselves to others in everyday life, what are some common strategies that people use? These are a couple of the questions we can ask. Let's go to the next slide. So what is the self? The self is a symbol. It uses social beings who can reflect on his or her own behavior. So there is a slight distinction between the self as a subject of awareness and the self as an object of awareness. We will go into a little further detail as we progress. The two researchers named James and Mead, they talked about the I and the me. The I is the self as the subject of awareness. So actively perceiving, thinking, and behaving in your own world. The me is the self as the object of awareness. And that is also called the self-concept, the sum total of a person's thoughts and feelings that define the self as an object. So William James, the first American psychologist, he talked about emotional identification with an object makes it part of your self concept. So the self changes over time. And James also said that things we emotionally identify with, they serve as the basis for judging our self-esteem. Going further, now we're talking about Herbert Mead, George Herbert Mead. And he said that the self emerges through social interaction. He asked, how does the generalized other help the person become a fully mature self? George Herbert Mead also said we must engage in perspective taking. Going further, we're going to talk about self-awareness. And self-awareness means a state of focused attention on yourself. It's associated with activity in your anterior cingulate cortex. And self-awareness develops in most humans about 18 months of age. And that has to do with certain neurons in the brain known as spindle neurons. So are we always self-aware? Well, we engage in maybe what's known as private self-awareness. That's being aware of our own hidden, private self aspects, becoming aware of personal standards of behavior, becoming aware of the mismatch between our personal standards and actual behavior. And then as a result of this, our mood and our feelings become more intensified. On the other hand, public self-awareness means aware of our publicly held, available self aspects. So becoming aware of our social standards of behavior and becoming a little more aware between our social standards and our actual behavior. And then underneath that it says we'll change our behavior to conform with social expectations. So if we feel a little bit apprehensive about our behavior, public self-awareness will help us to maybe become a little more interested in evaluating our apprehension. So what are the consequences of our self-awareness? Going forward, let's talk about self-regulation. The first known research that we heard about this is psychologists basically engaged in the marshmallow test. So as a reminder, please feel free to pause the video and then commit maybe a little more research on each topic if you're interested. Self-regulation, that just means it's our ability to control and direct our own actions. That allows us to delay gratification. And that also involves the importance of modeling, which means observing behavior and then engaging in behavior that we observe with others. So we must be self-aware in order to self-regulate. And self-regulate means basically being aware of our own behavior and then modifying it if necessary. So psychologists have said that sometimes we have a limited amount of energy, and each instance of self-regulation, it depletes our resource, which is our energy level. So when individuals are trying to regulate their emotions, they might become a little bit tired from doing that because psychologists have said that we have a limited amount of energy. So our cultures have a play in our self-concept. So there's two types of cultures we're going to talk about here. The first is known as individualist cultures, and that fosters independent self-construer. So keep in mind here, individualist means they are independent. They make up their own minds and make up their own decisions. On the other hand, those who belong to what is known as collectivist cultures, they foster interdependent self-construer. So that means the self is identified in part by connections and relationships with others. Again, a reminder, if you'd like to pause the video and look at each frame, feel free to do that. So as you can see, this was called the Penn study. Right here on this slide, it says, which pen would you choose? So the results of the Penn study, it basically says, what does this tell us about ourselves and our culture? Are they intertwined? Does our culture affect our behavior or mental processes? Okay, so what if we're part of two cultures, and that is called biculturalism. And those people can be socialized in multiple cultural frameworks. So people with multiple cultural identities, they engage in cultural frame switching in response to situational cues. That means according to their culture, they might say, well, this part of my culture would do this. And that is closely related to gender identity, identifying of the male or the female or another gender. That can affect our thoughts and behaviors as well. So this talks about North American cultures. Now we're moving forward to social identities. So those aspects of our self-concepts that are based on group memberships. So that helps us to establish like what and where we are in social terms. And that also helps provide a shared set of our beliefs, values, and goals to members. This slide says that when our social identities are sometimes formed by our ethnic identities. So an individual sense of personal identification with a particular ethnic group, that helps these groups cope with intolerance and non-acceptance. So one's ethnicity also has a play in their mental processes and their behaviors. Okay, so Finney's stages that are from our textbook, they state they're from the year 1991. So there are various stages. Stage one is that some individuals, they have unexamined ethnic identity. They don't even think about their own ethnic self-concept. They might internalize negative stereotypes. Stage two has to do with ethnic identity search. So maybe one of their experiences might cause their old worldview, makes them more receptive to exploring their own ethnicity. So the individual might reject anything dealing with dominant culture called the oppositional identity. Okay, so stage three of Finney's stages, that's when the individual, they are able to achieve ethnic identity. So that helps them to develop a deeper understanding of themselves. It can help serve as a buffer to negative stereotypes in a larger society. When the individual human being, when they do self-presentation, it might be strategic. According to psychologists, that's the process of presenting the self in particular ways to shape others' impressions. And if they fail in the self-presentation, they might get embarrassed by it. But if they keep succeeding, that might become automatic with practice. So what are some self-presentation strategies? The first one is known as ingratiation, and that involves flattery. The second one is modesty, downplaying our accomplishments. The next one is self-promotion, so stating your own accomplishments. And then underneath there's something called humble bragging. That's engaging in self-promotion, but masking our bragging by complaining about or displaying humility about our accomplishments. The next thing is called exemplification. That's when we show our integrity and moral worthiness. And others might engage in intimidation. That's convincing others that we are powerful and or dangerous. Okay, the next one is supplication. That's when a person advertises their weaknesses or dependence on others. And the very last one is called self-handicapping. And that's when we put obstacles in our own way as an excuse to fail. On this slide, we're going to talk about self-enhancement motive. Self-enhancement motive. And that's our desire to intercept or interpret situations to attain positive self-esteem, like taking care of our health and self-esteem. And psychologists have said that there is a dark side of high self-esteem. That's when the individualist cultures promote the idea that rejecting our negative feedback is important and healthy. But some psychologists have told us that negative feedback can be useful for us. So having high self-esteem, that can be stable or unstable. And if it's unstable, that is called narcissism. So a narcissist is very insecure and has the need for constant reassurance. And people with unstable high self-esteem, they might respond aggressively to negative feedback. And there's something else to think about high self-esteem and its dark side. So narcissists have two conflicting types of self-esteem. That is explicit and implicit. Feel free to pause the slide if you'd like to take a look at this in more in depth. So we're going to have a few slides here that have critical thinking questions. Once again, feel free to pause the slides and see if you would like to try to answer some of these questions. You might be inspired. So we're going to finish by summarizing this chapter. So as a reminder, the self is a symbol. It uses social beings who can reflect on their own behavior. And self-awareness is a psychological state in which we focus our attention on ourselves. And a quick reminder, that can be private or public form. So self-consciousness, on the other hand, is the habitual tendency to engage in self-awareness and can take private and public forms. And self-regulation is the ability to control and direct our own actions. But you must be self-aware in order to self-regulate. So after we engage in self-regulation, it'll be harder to self-regulate on other tasks. So individualist cultures foster the independent self, while collectivist cultures foster the interdependent self. High culturists, they view themselves and the world through both individualist and collectivist lenses, and can engage in cultural frame switching. That means some decisions they might think might be inspired by their one culture, and then some of their decisions or behavior might be inspired by the other culture. And we did talk about gender identity. It's our identification as male or female, or anything in between. The social identity includes the aspects of our self-concepts that are based on group memberships. While our ethnic identity is our sense of personal identification with a particular ethnic group and develops over 3 stages. So when we engage in strategic self-presentations, we do that to help shape other people's impressions of ourselves and achieve our ulterior goals. So self-presentation strategies include ingratiation, modesty, self-promotion, humble bragging, exemplification, intimidation, supplication, and self-handicapping. As a reminder, psychologists have told us that high self-esteem, that promotes good health, but it can have a dark side too. And it has high self-esteem, and that consists of explicit and implicit forms. And that's the end of our conversation. Thank you for joining us.